Okay, so here is my in progress scratch board that I have worked on. And this was one that I started a long time ago as a teacher example, and I sort of just add a little bit to it each semester. And eventually one day I'll have a finished piece. So what I wanted to do is show you my approach for starting to complete the scratch art section. Once I have the image transferred to the board. So you should be able to see there I've got the image and it's impressed very lightly into my scratch board. So I'm going to start over here on this side and show you sort of my approach. Now I always like to start with a section that is very easy. Of course, I don't like to jump into like the hardest part of the picture just because that's really nerve-wracking and kind of scary. So I like to start somewhere off to the side, something that's not super important, just so I can get a feel for what I'm doing, and kind of starting to establish a value scale, a value range, and trying to make accurate comparisons. Now, two really important things that you're going to keep in mind as you're working. You want to match your value. So whatever the value looks like in your resource picture is what you want it to look like on your board. And you also want to keep in mind the type of marks and the direction that your marks are going. You want those marks to either reiterate the texture that you see. So if something is fluffy or fuzzy or flowing in a certain direction, or if it's moving at a certain angle, you may want to show the directional lines of it. So for example, lines moving down the neck of that guitar, or lines moving up the planes of those walls. So keep that in mind. The direction and the kind of marks that you make should reiterate the form or the texture, and you're trying to replicate the value. So I'm going to start here with this section, and I like to compare it to like the edge of my white piece of paper. So it's really, really pretty light. And if you have your value scale for Scratchboard, you can compare it to that too to kind of help you get a good gauge for what that value structure should look like. So if I start, since I've already established that the walls are using, just vertical hatching marks going all in one direction. So therefore I've got to continue that over here. Now the wall is sort of tilted. So my lines are going to be tilted too, just the angle that I took this photograph with the camera. And I'm just going to start by establishing the value. Now the curtain here, there's going to be a really nice value contrast. Another trick is I like to either blow off the dust from the scratching as I'm working, or you can also keep a very soft paintbrush. You can just keep a paintbrush near it to brush that off. That's much better than using your fingers to wipe it off, any of those little dust particles, because sometimes that'll end up, I don't know, kind of making your values really sort of dingy. It'll almost grind them back down into the page. So I like to be really careful. Now, one of the really tempting things with Scratchboard is to outline everything. So if that's an edge, a lot of people just come down through and they outline it. But you don't necessarily want to do that because that's going to create a white outline around everything. And really what you want is a value next to a value comparison. So since I am using vertical marks, I do end up with lines that are right next to this edge, but I'm not necessarily specifically outlining it. Especially if I had horizontal lines coming in, I wouldn't want a big vertical line coming through to define that edge. You just want to let the shading of one area bump right up next to the edge of the shading for another area. With scratching too, I always sort of start off usually a little bit darker than what I think the finished value needs to be. Just because I don't want to scratch off too much too soon, because there's no way to add the black back onto my scratch board. So I just want to be very, very sort of cautious and careful. And now, if I set this value right next to it and I squint my eyes at it to where it sort of becomes blurred, I'm still much darker than what it will eventually need to be. But again, I'd rather start a little bit darker and then gradually lighten it rather than going too light too fast. So this is just helping me establish what the edge of this curtain looks like. So there you can see I'm lightening that up more than it was, and now I'm going to be ready to transition into this darker curtain. So in my earlier corner of the picture, I already established that I actually continued to use vertical hatch marks to create the folds and the wrinkles. So I'm going to continue using that, but I could also have chosen to maybe go across and try to make those lines feel like they curve around, like almost as if like those wrinkles were like individual cylinders. But since I already established vertical marks, I'm going to make sure that that's consistent throughout my image. So I'm just going to start by looking to see, I'm asking myself, where are the light values? And that's what I'm scratching. So I'm going to start right there in that like little highlight area. And I'm basically creating this little highlighted section here. Now, where this part is darker, I'm going to skip over that section and then start scratching on the other side where it's lighter. And I really like using these like little homemade scratch tools because you can get very light, very thin, detailed little marks with it. And one of the things that I notice about this curtain is it's lighter over here on the right-hand side, and then it gradually gets darker and then has a really nice dark edge. So I want to make sure I'm going to try to create that sense of fade in that value structure. And as I move across to the darker section of this curtain, I'm going to make smaller, more delicate kinds of marks. That way the overall value appears to be a little bit darker, and you can start to see that fade happening. And then where I need it brighter, just scratch away a little bit more and gradually pull out the lighter values. You're sort of just bringing those to the surface and drawing some attention to them. Now, right along this edge where the curtain gets really dark, right along there, I think for the moment I'm not going to scratch anything, just to help me create that transition between the white wall, that dark shadowy edge of the curtain, and then gradually fading into that lighter section of the curtain. So that's just one small little area to give you an example. Now, if I move over to one of the harder sections, if I start to look at, say, for example, the face right here, what I'm going to be looking for is still the contrast of value. So here the curtain is there's light coming through it, so it's very, very light in value, which gives me a good contrast between his darker shirt and the darker edge of his nose right here. His nose is much darker than the curtain. So always asking yourself, what's that value comparison? Which of those two objects, edge to edge, which one is darker and which one is lighter? And if you're keeping that in mind, that's going to help you make more accurate value comparisons. Now, we run into a little bit of a problem here along the bridge of his nose. The bridge of his nose has a bright highlight on it, which for just that one small area actually becomes lighter than the curtain behind it. There's a little bit of that shadow from the window pane behind the curtain, and his nose actually gets lighter. So thinking about all of that in your value structure is really important. It's just simply a very, very simple series of questions. Which is lighter? Which is darker? Which is lighter? Which is darker? Lighter, darker, lighter, darker, lighter, darker. Just right as you move through the edges of an object. So if I start in that section, just so I don't lose it, and I know it's hard to see on a screen, but I'm going to start First off, by figuring what kind of marks I want to use on his face. I know with the curtains, I've got to create those vertical marks. So let me just establish that really light value right there in that little nook, right there underneath his nose. And I want to make sure that I scratch right up to the edge of his nose. I'm not going to outline it, but again, I'm just going to scratch right up to the edge. And come right down to the edge of his shirt. So I know that seems really insignificant, but establishing that light value is going to help me tremendously, just sort of setting up that background as I move into this next portion. So I think I'll move up the background into this part, which gets a little bit darker, so that way the nose can be lighter. And now I think what I'll do is pull this section a little bit lighter. I'm going to get rid of some of those little dark marks, make them fainter and smaller, just to really make this part a really nice bright highlight in that like little crevice. So I think that looks pretty good. Now I can sort of see a very gradual transition between the lightest and then slightly darker. I can always keep lightening that slightly darker section as I need to. But what that does for me now is it starts to define the edge of his nose without it necessarily being a highlight. And I think when I start thinking about the marks, I may want them to wrap and kind of go across, over, and down his nose, because then I think I want them to flow across his cheekbones up that way. So I'm going to turn my whole picture just so it's a little bit easier. And now where I have that highlight right across the bridge of his nose, with just the tiniest little marks that I can make. Now his eye right here gets much darker, so I'm going to let that fade and kind of wrap around, leaving that eye portion dark. This background comes right up to that part, and that defines his eyelashes. So I'm going to scratch around those eyelashes. Now his nostril down here is completely dark, so I'm going to say that's my darkest section. So what I need to do is actually scratch the skin around it just a tiny bit lighter. But again, I want to do this really delicately because this area is pretty much in shadow. So with just very tiny, soft little marks. Then they're going to start to flow down that cheekbone. And I'm just sort of trying to keep in mind where are the shadows. This part of his nose gets darker, so I'm going to not scratch around there. I'm going to scratch beside it. And that's going to start to establish the nose, but I've got fewer marks that are a little bit more delicate, so therefore they show up as darker than the background. The same way here, it's darker than that background. And everything's just a very, very gradual, slow, just a careful thought process and thinking about the value structure. Where are the lights? Where are the darks? And what kind of marks should I be making? And so now that's the beginning stages of it. I can refine and do a lot more detail and make values pop out a little bit more where I don't want things to be too dark. But that starts to help me establish the value structure on that face right there.